Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters for Monotype, the show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Cadley, and today I'm thrilled to be talking with Shar Biggers. I first met Shar after seeing her speak at Brand New Conference a few years ago, and her presentation was all around branding and especially branding companies for underrepresented founders. And she was just a really charming speaker, really vibrant. I also thought it was really cute that her grandmother was in the audience. But yeah, we just connected after her presentation, and then I wanted to get her on the podcast, and it sort of turned into this long process because she ended up landing a pretty intense role. So Shar led one of last year's most intense and consequential rebrands, the rebrand of the 2024 Democratic campaign. Shar was already really knee-deep in the brand refresh for the Biden-Harris campaign last July, and we all remember the day when Biden withdrew his candidacy and the Democratic Party united behind Kamala Harris for president. So this left Shar needing to do a lot of work really quickly, and they had to change course really fast. So this is how she describes it.
I think we had about 3 hours to come up with a logo, like an interim logo. That was just something that we could have in between time before we figured out what we were doing next. We did somewhere around 30 to 40 logo options, and we ended up changing out every asset, thousands of assets, like in about 6 hours. And by the next day, everything was flipped.
Here to preview this episode with me is my co-host, Carl. Hi, Carl.
Hey, Cadley. Man, am I excited for this week's episode. You've been working on putting this together for quite some time. So yeah, what were you most excited to talk about with Shar?
I was most excited to take listeners into some of the day-to-day pressures and all of the creative thinking that goes into working on a project like this with such high stakes, and especially in such a short time frame.
Yeah, it's a little different, if you do a rebrand for laundry detergent and it flops, it's not good, but life goes on. This is a much bigger deal.
Absolutely. And, working at Monotype, I was also very curious about her process for choosing type. Just like, how do you go about choosing a typeface for the most famous woman in the United States?
Yeah. Well, it's a real honor to have her on the show today. And I'm excited that you got to sit down and speak with her. So without further delay, let's turn it over to you and Shar.
Hi, Shar. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today.
Thank you so much, Cadley, for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to you today as well. We're finally making it happen.
Yeah, it's been a minute, but you've been busy.
Yeah.
If you could just start by kind of like introducing yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Shar Biggers. I am a creative director. So I run a design studio called Salea, and I have been working in design, over a decade, I believe now. And of course, began as a designer and sort of moved my way into creative direction. I've worked for a lot of different types of clients, but I would say probably I'm most known for my work in politics, which is really interesting because I'm not a political person, really.
How did you start getting into this political work? Like you said, it's not like maybe something you were seeking out. So I think an obvious place for us to start is with your work on the 2016 Hillary campaign.
Yeah, I actually did not apply for the position for the Hillary for America campaign. I was freelancing, and for some reason, I just decided to start applying for jobs that week. I can't even tell you what I applied for, but somehow from what I remember, my name was referred over to Jennifer Kynan. She ended up looking at my portfolio, and she was the creative director for 2016. So she ended up reaching out to me and was like, would you be interested in working on the campaign? It's really hard. You got to work 7 days a week. You're not going to get much sleep, but it'll be the best time of your life. Yay. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. And I remember saying to her, I need to think about this. Like, I don't know. And she said, okay, great. Sounds good. Go ahead. Take a couple days and we'll touch base again. I immediately went to my mom because I was like, Mom, I'm not really a political person, Mom. Like, I don't know. And then she just began to talk me through Hillary Clinton's background and accomplishments and Bill Clinton and the effect that they had on us personally when Bill Clinton was president, like us as a family. And of course, I was very, very young, so I did not remember these things or know a lot of the things she shared. And that was enough impact for me to say, okay, I think this is something that I want to try. And so I said yes. And that's how I ended up getting into it. And we were a pretty big team. I think we were a team of like, cannot remember exactly how many. And a lot of us still are pretty close today or talk still today. So yeah, it was a great experience.
In your role on that campaign, were you a designer?
Yeah, I was a designer and I worked on the states and coalitions team mostly. So doing states work, which ended up staying with me because I'm very passionate about the states, but ultimately the states are what lead us to win elections. So really, really important and impactful work, and working with coalitions as well, making sure that the different groups that we advocate for have everything it is that they need in order to gain supporters in that space. And so doing quite a bit of branding and sub-branding, everything from business cards and placards to flyers and posters. One of the things about working a presidential campaign is that anything you've ever dreamed of designing, you'll probably touch that and get a chance to do that on a campaign.
How was that work different than like the other branding and design work that you had done, maybe for companies like Amazon and stuff like that?
It's different because I had always been taught when I went to design school, especially, it was like kind of beat into me that everybody cannot be your target audience. You've got to position the brand or that you work with and really kind of hone in on who that audience is. And that is usually going to be a very specific group, maybe 1 to 3 groups, if it is a primary, secondary, or tertiary audience, right? But with a campaign, you are literally trying to reach everybody. And even the people who are opponents or on the other side, you want to reach them also. You want them to come over to your side. So you're literally trying to reach every American. And that is very different from the things that you're usually taught, I'd say, in branding. And so you kind of have to shift your mindset and then think about, instead of honing in how you can make things more broadly appeal to people, you'd be surprised how things like illustration style or certain colors can throw things off and miss the audience it is that you need to reach. And so there are certain things you need to avoid. It needs to have much more of a mass appeal. So it's different, I would say, in every way when it comes to that, when it comes to how you position the brand and therefore how the visual aesthetic will end up feeling.
I'm assuming you still are receiving a brief like you would with any other project.
You do still receive briefs. Well, I honestly should say, it depends on the campaign, right? Because not every campaign is the same. So it's really going to come down to what is the process that campaign is using in intaking new projects. But in 2016, we very much always received briefs for what it is that we were doing. At least I did for my projects. But I would say that because in politics, a lot of the times, the people that are submitting those briefs, they're very much like clients, right? Who they don't necessarily know exactly what they're asking for or exactly what the expectations are or sometimes even what they need. You'll meet honestly with different teams as if they are clients and walk through, okay, this is what we heard you said you needed. Is this accurate? Here's what we think. We think you actually may need this instead of that. And that is kind of how we'll kind of move through the process. So it's similar to a bit of an internal agency. And the goal is that they come to your internal agency and not do it DIY, which is a very, very normal in politics to do things yourself, right? Hop in Canva, design something on your own. And we want to discourage that because we need this to be a very unified campaign that looks consistent. But if you think about it, you're talking about we're working with offices that are a part of our campaign across all the states and so many different groups. and allies right. And so people need to be able to use your brand. It can be very, very tough to get control of that and make sure that everybody is aligned on one page using the brand identity guidelines we have in place.
I can only imagine. Wild. It's even hard like within a major organization with a number of people. So this is perfect because it's leading into a lot of questions I have around the Kamala campaign. So if we could just shift gears a little bit into the behind the scenes of this campaign. You went through, I think, 3 different rebrands. Is that true? So like you initially were hired to work on the Biden campaign, correct?
I was initially brought on to do Biden Harris. And what was requested of me was to do a refresh, right, for Biden Harris, make it feel a little bit stronger in the area of typography and tighten up the color scheme. So just tighten the brand guidelines and figure out what's really working and what might not be working as well based on where they want to go. So that's what it started out as, plus coming in and scaling up the team and then creating that internal agency for the campaign. It was a lot to try to get people to move to Wilmington, Delaware, which is where we were based. And, there's not a whole lot in Wilmington. It's a nice city, but it's very, very small. And I would say a lot of the people live in the suburbs. So convincing great talent to come out to Wilmington is already tough. And then we're technically operating in a space where we don't have a whole lot of funds for salary. So it was just like, that was a job by itself. I tried to establish at least a small team first. And then we started to work on the Biden rebrand. And we were really, at that point, I feel like kind of knee deep in that when the flip happened. So we had already started the process and of course had no idea that a candidate switch was going to occur. And when the flip occurred, I think we had about 3 hours to come up with a logo, like an interim logo.
Insane.
That was just something that we could have in between time before we figured out what we were doing next, right? And we didn't really know. We knew a real brand would have to come, but we didn't have yet any direction. It was just like everything was happening so quickly. A lot of times people think we saw it coming. We did not see it coming. And so we had 3 hours to do the interim logo. I think we did somewhere around 30 to 40 logo options. And this is kind of where my experience kicked in from 2016, because I knew what things we needed to start with and how the first logo that a candidate may have when they first start is usually often not like the official logo yet. And so I know what that kind of interim logo kind of looks like. And so it was okay to move toward that. And we were inspired a bit by Hillary Clinton and Obama, of course, and that's what we used, but we needed it to still be within the Biden brand. So it still used the same typefaces, still pretty much stayed within the same color scheme, but like more refined. We swapped out the ivory, moved more toward white. And that's what we started with. So we ended up changing out every asset, thousands of assets, like in about 6 hours. And by the next day, everything was flipped.
Oh my gosh. What kind of tools and like processes do you use when you're making like that many changes in that short of a period of time?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when something is moving that fast, at that point, you're just trying to get things out as quickly as possible. And people are emailing like, we need this, we need that, we've got to change this, we've got to change that. And you're just managing, as best as you can to get things done for people. That's kind of how we did things. But our communication tools are kind of the normal tools that I feel like designers use, which is very much Slack.
Mm-hmm. And when you were working on this like interim branding, how long did you have until you would start working on like the proper, finalized campaign for Kamala?
Well, we did not have much time to get comfortable, right? We knew better than to get comfortable because we knew this was temporary. And so there was about 2 weeks. Keep in mind that in that 2 weeks, we're still dealing with like the assassination attempt, and we are also dealing with like the news cycle, and things are still happening, right? So we had about 2 weeks, and then towards the end of that 2 weeks, we started working on the final brand. And we had partnered with Wide Eye. Wide Eye worked with Kamala in 2019 and in the primaries. And so we partnered with Wide Eye again and did the final branding. And so it was a 5-day sprint. We were moving so quickly because she was also going to announce who her VP pick was going to be. And so that was really interesting because on our side, a lot of people don't know is that we don't know who the candidate is going to be. People think, okay, they know already. Like, no, we don't know. We also are guessing. And so we have to design for every pick we think it could be. So I think we had, if I'm not mistaken, at first we started out with like somewhere between 6 to 8 options. And we're designing all the options, about 6 different options we're designing for logo, for everything, just in case.
Insane.
Right? So everything you're designing 6 times.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Absolutely wild.
Yeah. You're designing 6 landing pages. You're designing everything. So you have to be ready for that change to happen. And so we're not just designing the brand identity. We're also designing the brand identity with every last one of these VP picks.
And what sort of like values trickle down into the different options? So like looking at different potential like VP candidates, like, is there anything that you're looking at, like for this particular person, maybe they would influence the design this way?
No, because everything is really about your main candidate, which was VP Kamala Harris. So the focus was still going to be on her. But I think the thing that you have to pay attention to is going to be the logo. Does this logo style work for every last one of these names? That can get a little bit tricky because it needs to be able to work for a name that has 4 letters and a name that has 8 or 9 letters, which is a very, very intense process. I'll just say that. We were really looking at that more than anything and just making sure that felt nice. And that really is going to come down to typography. And one thing that Kamala loved about her 2019 campaign design is she loves bold typography. And she's really influenced by typography from like the 70s. And she kind of likes like that retro bold feeling. And that was something that carried over to 2024 as well. It looked a little different, of course, but it was like still bold typography. And so that was something that we were going to continue. And if you're going to do that, then you got to make sure that how you execute the logo type feels right. So we weren't trying to create a logo that was iconic, right? We were trying to create a logo that very clearly got across who this was. This is Harris-Walz. Like, that's who this is. And we don't have a lot of time to tell you that. And typically you have 18 months and people are going to know who the candidate is at this point. But we're going into the Democratic convention like in 2 or 3 weeks at this point, and they don't know their candidate yet. So it's important that it's very clear for you to know who this is. These are their names, just in case you don't know, right? So we're introducing our candidate. So it was very, very important that the logo was clear and to the point, practical. We're not trying to create like this iconic thing. It was more so all about reintroducing people to the Democratic campaign, reintroducing people to our new candidates. And that was the most important thing.
Harris had sounds like she has a soft spot for this like bold kind of 70s style type. Did you have, ideas for the type already once you had that in mind, or was that like a collaborative process along with Wide Eye? Or
yeah, Wide Eye already had a few different directions, of course. They were looking at this font called Sans Plume. It's a really practical font. It's bold. It's sturdy. It does all the things we need it to do. But what's interesting is it gets really kind of quirky in its lowercase letters. And so at first we were looking at, okay, her real personality has a quirkiness to it in her real life. And so it was kind of like, do we capture that? Do we not capture that? Here was my thought. My thought was, being that she is going up as potentially the first woman of color to become president of the United States, I felt that we couldn't take that risk. Mm-hmm. I, as a Black woman myself, felt that I know how unforgiving the public can be sometimes when it comes to things like titles and being the first to do something, or are you qualified for this? Do you deserve a seat at the table? All the things, right, that come alongside being the first one to try to break the glass ceiling. And this wasn't my first time doing that. This was my second time trying to elect the first woman president. And the first time, I remember the things that we later felt like may have been mistakes. Do we call Hillary Clinton by her first name? Right? We chose to call her Hillary. Later on, it was like, was that a mistake? Mm-hmm. For Joe Biden, we didn't say Joe. Mm-hmm. We called him automatically by his last name, Mm-hmm. It's like these differences between being man and woman that a lot of times people aren't noticing, but they are differences, and it communicates whether we respect them or not, how we're seeing them, right? And you have to pay close attention to these small nuances. And so for me, I was really probably much more sensitive to how we were to communicate her out to the public. And I wanted to be careful to protect her from the stereotypes that I know that people can create around being a woman and then a woman of color. Mm-hmm. So I leaned away from us using the lowercase letters and just leaning into uppercase to really get across the boldness and strength of her character and lean and focus on that, and then find another typeface still in a sans that could communicate lowercase and uppercase.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then Denton came in as a feminine voice. And this is where I actually differed from 2016, because in 2016, some things we would lean away from when it came to Hillary Clinton being feminine, because it was like, do we lean into her femininity? Do we show that? Or do we lean into her strength only? Mm-hmm. Of course, people will debate, what's the best way to approach that. But I felt that this time I did want to find a way to, even if it was just a nod to her being a woman, I felt it would needed to be in there. And so I began to really, really push for the use of the Denton typeface. It has this beautiful curviness to it, especially in its italic form. And so I thought it would be important to pull something like that in. And in the end, it ended up being a great balance in the campaign to do that. So I think it was the right decision.
Mm-hmm. It's very elegant.
Yeah, very elegant typeface. I love it so much. It ended up being a fan favorite for sure. And we began to do like these installations of the word vote in Denton italics, and people had a lot of fun with those.
How do you balance like quality and speed when you're producing thousands of placards in different languages?
Yeah, this is a good question. This was actually, to be honest, one of the toughest challenges of our campaign, because of the fact that we needed to produce really quickly. We were already, I would say, severely behind. With Hillary, one of the first things that she did was get our branding executed and then pull in a team for design really early. It was something that was very, very valuable to Hillary, but she also wasn't in office, right? So already, right, she had time. She wasn't running the country, right? So at the time, so she could like take the time to craft things, right? Biden's running the country. Kamala's helping to run the country. They're busy, right? Yeah. And so by the time we input the design or the creative team, what ended up happening was we didn't have as much of the time to put those things together early. So this is all starting really at the latter half of the campaign. So it's already starting much later. And then we're hiring people, we're putting in processes. And up until this point, I think the campaign had been using external resources or DIYing their work. So you're coming in on the latter half and you're also trying to shift behavior, which is really hard to do. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to say, hey, come to us rather than it being established already. And so it just presented a lot of different challenges because if you DIY things, then you can get it done quickly. Whether it's done with quality is a different question, but you can get it done really quickly, right? But in this case, here we are coming in at the latter half, and it's like, where have you been? And it's like, yeah, we're here now. Come to us, please. Let us do it. But then also you need time to make sure it's done well, and you don't have time.
Right.
And then you introduce that candidate flip and you really don't have time. Okay. So if I'm honest, there were mistakes made. It's inevitable. And I talk about that a bit in the case study where it's like, there would be some times where like different blogs or sites, publications would like come across work that we had done in just such a rush. You know, we just didn't have the time to do what we really wish to have done. And then we were a really young team. So we're trying to turn over maybe like a massive event. And it might be like some people's first time ever doing that. Plus they're getting a brand new identity and they don't know how to use it yet, or they only have the logo so far. And we don't have a brand guideline yet. And there were so many complications. And then you're talking about 3 rebrands, and it takes time for a team to learn a brand. But we don't have time for that. We weren't given the luxury of learning a new brand, right? And we're constantly turning over the work. I would say that was the toughest thing, was making sure that all of the work always came out as its highest quality that it could be. And ultimately, we had to come to a compromise where it's like, you get it to where the best that you can in each situation. And sometimes that looks different depending on what the deliverables were. But eventually we did start to find our groove. And once we did, it was great. It was no looking back at that point.
What are some of the design elements or projects from this campaign that you're most proud of?
There's so many, but I think what I really loved was by the end, the design really started to find its groove. And though there's a lot of debate back and forth around the concerts, quote unquote, or the Vote for Freedom tour, it was a very bold move and something that we hadn't quite seen before, to have events that had music in this unique way. And regardless of what you think about it, it was a risk that was taken. And for that, like I always honor people that take risk, right? And the teams that take risk, you know, when they're trying to reach a goal, something as big as this. And I really loved having the chance to work on the branding for the Vote for Freedom tour. We had a very short time to do that. I think we had initially like 24 hours to really actually do it. It was like in discussion for a minute, and it was like, is it going to be a tour? Are we just going to have like the last leg, have like a really distinct branding just to let people know we've entered this final phase? And ultimately, we decided to make it more of focused around being a tour, because they were trying to figure out like, how do we really get people motivated to vote? And so we ended up, once we actually got focused and was like, okay, we know what this is, it ended up being about a 24-hour sprint for us before like the first big presentation of like, okay, this is what we think it should be. And we presented our 3 directions. And what we loved about it is it gave us a chance to like do something fresh and push political design in a way that I haven't seen before. And that was fun. You know, we're all about typography, and let's like really push that. Like what happens when we turn the typography sideways and like bring in motion graphics into this. And since it's a concert, it gives us the perfect excuse to be able to do that, where usually you wouldn't have a good excuse to use motion as much outside of video. So it gave us a chance to like really experiment and play in a way that we haven't been able to do before, and take the events up to the scale of a concert, where usually it might feel a little more local, and there may be more hand done elements and hand drawing placards or posters or banners, right? For this, you can be polished and you scale it up really big. For example, if you think about the final Philly rally where Oprah and Kamala Harris were speaking together and Lady Gaga performed, and it's like on the rocky steps, you really get a chance to design out that event. But you also have like no time to do it. So it's like extremely stressful. We had a bunch of concerts in one day. It was 8 cities one day. And you do all these different events and you're having to manage that and do the branding for it in what, 20, I think ultimately altogether we ended up having about 48 hours, maybe a little over that. And then you execute all of the events, the signage, all the banners, the flyers, the posters, the this, the that go with that. But we got it done.
And were you and your team at any of these events, or were you mostly like just behind your computer working?
So we usually are not at the events because the amount of work that we are doing kept us locked in at our desk. And it was even that way in 2016. As designers, we're constantly working. We're working late. And the reason why is because we have to be available and kind of on call for whatever. And that call can come in the middle of the night, right? And so we had designers that were often on call till late night, and then designers on call early morning to be ready for whatever. You kind of just get used to the fact that you don't get to participate as much, but the reward comes in seeing the work out there.
Right.
I would say the drawback to that, though, is that like the team doesn't get to see their work out in the world as much. You see it on TV, you see it on social media, but it's a different thing to be out in the world and literally see your work everywhere constantly. And because we're at work all day, every day, all day, every day, you're participating in this thing that's massive and reaching the entire world, but it's almost like you're busy somewhere else. So you don't get a chance to really take that all in until it's over.
Right.
And that part is hard because everyone else is out there and they see the impact. They get to, I'd say a lot of the other different departments, they get a chance to experience that. And even in creative, video gets to go out because they're doing video. That's definitely one of the tougher parts about working a campaign. So you have to find a way to live vicariously through other people and to make sure that you're in the news, you're looking at social, and you find a way to appreciate it that way, digitally, mostly.
That makes a lot of sense. You were talking about how you had like 24 hours maybe to like iterate and like play. So do you think like these design constraints, I know obviously they present a lot of challenges, but do you think that in a way like this pushes out work that maybe you wouldn't have been able to create had you had 2 weeks?
That's a good question. I would say in this particular case for the concert, this was one of the times where like we don't have as many constraints, right? Because typically we would have constraints. Things need to stick tightly within the brand. This was the first time where it was like, we want this brand to feel like an evolution, and actually it shouldn't look like what our brand has looked like up until this point. It should look like if our brand had a baby and it was a really fun baby. And so it was like, we can have fun, we can push. And because it's a concert, we could have a chance to do something that politics maybe has not seen at this level. And that was a chance that like we were not going to turn down. We were like, oh yeah, like this is what we've been begging you guys to do. We're going to do it. It was a lot of fun. But the time constraint part, it really pushes you to learn how to iterate with speed. And I think that one of the biggest lessons that our team learned in this was how to produce your best work in just hours. And designers, like, of course, we want more time. But one of the things that we learn how to do is just to produce much more quickly and to create systems in which we could then take what was produced and, because we made a lot of brand identities, by the way, not just the 3, we made a ton of sub brands, whether it be for different programs and initiatives or states teams or this, or I've never used the word brand so much in a short period of time. We need a new brand for this. We need a new brand for that. I'm like, do you need a new brand? Do you actually need a new brand? So we would create so many sub brands, and you had to learn how to do that quickly. You might have a few hours to do it. You might have 24 hours if you're lucky. And so that was what we took away from it, is that like, when we first started, most of us, we were used to creating a brand in maybe a month, and here you just didn't have that luxury, but it did push us to become much stronger designers that by the end, like, they're like, we need a brand in 24 hours. We're like, we'll get it done. Before it was like, are you crazy? You need a brand how quickly? No, I think you've lost your mind. I can't do that. And so it was just a shift in perspective and a shift in how quickly we could cause our talents to do what we needed to do.
What advice would you offer to designers kind of facing similarly demanding projects in like super fast-paced environments like this?
Advice for designers who are handling super fast-paced projects like this. I think the best thing you can do is to adapt and always be in a position where your skills are tight. It's like your skills are already prepared for situations like this. So once something like this comes about, you are already extremely strong when it comes to the different parts of design, the different pieces of design, the different elements of design, where it's like, okay, if somebody says we need a brand identity executed in 24 hours, can you do it? It's like, okay, I've already got sort of like toolkits in a sense that are prepared for situations like these. But at the same time, you also can't really prepare all the way for a situation where you need to work at such a high speed, especially if it's something you've never done before. And so I think ultimately the answer is definitely going to be to really hone in on your craft so that you can be ready for any and everything.
I guess, yeah, do you have any advice for designers, creatives? How can they get into working into the political space?
So I would recommend that designers start small. It's really good to do that because that way, one, it's not such a shock when you go into a presidential campaign. It can be quite a learning curve. The industry of politics has its own language, its own culture, its own everything, honestly. And the best thing that you can do, even if you consider yourself to be very passionate about politics and you feel like, well, I feel like I would already know, I promise you, internally, it is a different culture than what you will be used to as a designer. And so the best advice that I could give is to start working either with political organizations and doing work with them, volunteer work, partnering up with maybe local elections that are happening, and maybe even offering to do volunteer work. Or if you find out somebody is running and they have not designed a brand identity yet, or you get wind of it, or, there's different ways to break in, right? But like, find a way to break into politics at a local level and start there, because there is like a really sharp separation, I'd say, between designers who work in design as a career versus the path of just going into politics. Often what you'll see in politics is like designers end up kind of accidentally becoming designers in politics. And they really were like working in something else, and then they end up doing design. And so there's kind of like this separation that happens. Designers often have this deep desire to be in politics, but they never quite cross the bridge that they need to really build those connections. And people in politics would love to have those connections. Like, often they don't know a whole lot of designers or a whole lot of agencies, a whole lot of studios. So I think it is just starting the conversation, offering to do work with them at a local level. And then you'd be surprised how quickly that will grow. And then once it's time for the next presidential election, going on the website and applying, you'd be surprised how many designers are not doing that. So they're like, how can I get involved? It's like, well, apply. You should apply. You should definitely apply. Have you applied yet? No, I haven't applied. Okay, you should definitely apply. We look at applications. So doing it that way. And you'll find that you can very quickly get involved. There's a lot of work to be done and not a lot of designers in the space.
Mm-hmm.
It's much easier for people to break in than they actually think it is. So that would be my advice on how to get involved.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So in going through working on this campaign, what have you learned about yourself?
I've learned that there is nothing that I can't do if I make a decision in my mind that I'm doing it, and that no matter what, I am purposed to walk a certain path and to live out my destiny on this earth. And I know that might sound a little bit deep, but for me, that is a really important thing, because this was the most challenging job I've ever worked. You know what I mean? Like, it's the most challenging thing I've ever done. And I went through a lot of tests and trials in this position. I suffered through a very tough car accident. I also had an apartment fire. I lost everything in 3 weeks of doing this position. I had to scale a team up to 20 from nothing. I had to be a first-time manager in an extremely chaotic, tough, hard environment. I suffered through diagnoses. Like, I went through so many things in about 7 or 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times where I wanted to throw in the towel and walk away and quit. Like, I didn't want to do it, if I'm honest with you,
Mm-hmm.
because of everything I had suffered through in my personal life and even things in the role. And I had to make the decision that no matter what I was going through and the weight of my purpose and the weight of what I feel destined to walk through, that I wasn't going to turn around and go back the other way. I was going to stick with my yes, and I was going to walk it out no matter what blows life threw at me. And so ultimately, in the midst of all of those things, in the midst of feeling misunderstood often, in the midst of having to do things for the first time, in the midst of just all the things, I had to realize that I had what it took inside of me to do it, even though there were many days I felt like I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And because I got through it, I realized that there was nothing I couldn't do. After that, I can do whatever I put my mind to, and I'll never question that again. I can't say that I didn't question that before. Before this role, I often questioned what I could achieve. Could I do that? Or I would often say I could never do that. I could never do. But after this, I said, I'll never question myself again. Am I going to be perfect? No, no. But can I get it done? Yes.
I feel like any work you take on now is going to feel like, oh, we have this many months to do this. Like,
yeah,
cakewalk.
Yeah. I feel like the biggest thing I took away from this, Catley, is that I'm leaving stronger than I walked in.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so much stronger than when I walked in. I feel like I went through the fire in both my personal life and my professional life at the same time in a way I can't explain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so funny because I remember I talked to Jennifer Kynan, who very much kind of mentored me through the situation. And I still see very much as my mentor. And the first time I did the campaign, I suffered through a very tragic loss of a very close family member. And I ended up being kind of an advocate against gun violence on the campaign. And that happened in my first 2 weeks of working on the Hillary campaign. And she just jumped in and was there in full support. And I remember when this happened this time, she jumped in with full support and she was like, Shar, you can do this. I don't know why these things keep happening, but you can do this. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know. She was really such a cheerleader for me and a person that believed in me, that helped me believe in myself.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely is one of the reasons why I'll never question again. So yeah, I would say that's my biggest takeaway about me.
Looking to the future, what are you excited about as far as where your career is going? What kind of work are you excited to do or interested to do?
Yeah, I've been working on launching a startup for a while that I've just sort of been sitting on for multiple reasons. I need to get funding for it. And, I often talk about how it can be really tough as a woman of color trying to launch a new business and get funding that you need. And which is one of the reasons that I support underrepresented founders a lot in my work as far as like my clientele goes. And so I myself am moving back into the place where I'm launching a product. I sold phone cases while I was in design school, and that paid for me to get through design school. That store, it was an Etsy shop. And I'm going to do the same thing, but at a much greater scale, still selling phone cases and a few other types of products, tech products. I've been sitting on this for years, and I said, I feel like after what I just went through, this is the right time and the right season for me to do it. And so I'm preparing for that. And then also just getting Saleya to its next level. One thing about this last position that it helped me with was it helped me face the fears that I had about scaling and really building a team. And now that I feel like I've learned a lot in that space, the things that you should do and the things you shouldn't do, I'm excited about growing that. And I am taking the next steps that I need to do that. So really growing Saleya and also pushing the purpose and mission that drives the business, which is helping underrepresented founders, but especially people that have financial disadvantages and compounded disadvantages that they have to work through as business owners, really pushing to be a source for them that they can use to be able to compete against some of the giants of their industries and to be someone that helps them get there at a much larger scale. So I think taking the business up a notch and building awareness around what it is that we're trying to do are definitely massive goals for me, because right now those audiences, they often are largely unaware of branding and the impact that it has on their business. And so it's just like this education component that I think I really want to tackle.
It's wonderful. It's also a really crazy full circle moment, because I first came to know your work at a conference, and this was the topic of your presentation, was like branding and the impact that it can have on underrepresented communities. So, obviously it's something that's really important to you. So it deserves attention, and now you have the space to focus on it. So
for sure. I'm excited about that. So now we're full steam ahead for sure.
Well, thank you so much for really taking us behind the scenes of what goes into a campaign like this, and especially this year where it was a lot crazier than we ever could have predicted. So really appreciate your time and telling your story.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that this helps somebody. I hope somebody is able to take something away from it. I'm always happy to share transparently, like, these are the things I've gone through. These are the challenges. This is the truth. Like, this is the truth. I hope it helps.
You can check out Shar's work at saleya.agency. That's SALEAH.agency. There's a design case study on her website if you'd like to dive deeper.
Thanks for listening. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate us, and share us with a friend. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Take care.